As Myra's voice reached its peak, the stage darkened, and unexpected images flickered behind her. Gasps rippled through the audience, confusion turning to shock. In the pit, Leon's baton paused, his calm demeanor betraying nothing. Whatever was unfolding, it was no ordinary performance, and the night was far from over. The grand piano stood as a centerpiece in the lavish parlor, its polished surface gleaming under the warm, golden light of the chandelier. Leon's fingers danced over the keys, the melody a mix of soaring hope and undercurrents of melancholy. Music was his language, his refuge, and his way of communicating the emotions he could never quite put into words. Myra's voice soared in harmony, her soprano filling the room with a haunting beauty that seemed to bend the very air. Watching her, Leon felt the same pang of pride he always did. She wasn't just his wife. She was his muse, his equal in passion and art. They were inseparable, he thought. But that night, the song ended abruptly. Myra's phone buzzed from the corner of the room, its sharp trill slicing through the last fading note. She excused herself with a tight smile, her laughter filtering through the doorway as she disappeared into the hall. Leon sat at the piano, staring after her, his hands resting on the keys as silence filled the void she left behind. Lately, these interruptions had become routine. Mira, always full of warmth and light, had grown distant, her time split between her rehearsals and private coaching sessions with Daniel, a vocal coach Leon had once admired, but now regarded with quiet suspicion. Something about the way Mira spoke about Daniel unsettled him. Her laughter when she mentioned his name, the subtle but telling shift in her tone. Still, Leon told himself it was paranoia. He had no reason to doubt Myra's loyalty, but the doubts gnawed at him, like a dissonant chord that refused to resolve. That night, unable to shake the unease, Leon lingered in the shadows as Mira paced the hallway, her voice low and urgent into the phone. "It's too risky," she said, her voice laced with tension. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Leon's chest tightened. He strained to hear the other side of the conversation, but the voice was too muffled to make out. Mira ended the call quickly, tucking the phone into her purse before heading back into the room. "Everything okay?" Leon asked, forcing a smile as she re-entered. She hesitated for the briefest moment before returning his smile, her expression smooth and unreadable. "Just rehearsals," she said, her voice as light as air. Leon nodded, but as Mira leaned in to kiss him, the faint scent of cologne, not his, lingered in the space between them. Later that night, as Mira slept beside him, Leon lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind churned with questions he wasn't ready to ask and answers he feared he already knew. The harmony of their marriage had been broken, replaced by a discordant melody he couldn't ignore. The first cracks had formed, and though Leon didn't yet know it, his symphony of vengeance was about to begin. Leon sat at the piano the next morning, his fingers tracing idle patterns over the keys. The music wouldn't come, not with the dissonance in his heart. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Mira hummed as she prepared coffee, as though everything were perfectly normal. He watched her closely, too closely perhaps, taking note of the way she seemed more distracted than usual. She wasn't humming one of their pieces, but a song Daniel had composed for her last showcase. The familiarity of it made Leon's jaw tighten. As the days passed, his suspicions solidified. Myra's schedule became more erratic. Her rehearsals with Daniel stretched late into the night, and when she returned home, there was an edge to her exhaustion that Leon couldn't place. When he asked her about it, she waved him off with airy excuses, brushing his concern aside like a smudge on a windowpane. "I'm just tired, Leon," she said one night as she slipped into bed, turning her back to him before he could press further. It was the turning point for Leon. If he didn't have answers, he would find them himself. One evening, when Mira left for another rehearsal, Leon followed her. He stayed far enough back to avoid being seen, his heart hammering in his chest. She drove to a secluded part of the city, to a private studio he hadn't known Daniel owned. Parking across the street, Leon watched as she entered the building, greeted by Daniel with a warm embrace that lingered too long. Leon felt his stomach churn, but he forced himself to stay. He couldn't let assumptions drive his actions. He needed proof. After an hour of waiting, Leon approached the studio. Through a narrow window, he saw Mira and Daniel seated at a piano. Their heads were close, their smiles intimate in a way that made Leon's chest ache. Daniel's hand brushed Myra's cheek, and though Leon couldn't hear the words exchanged, the tenderness in their gestures spoke volumes. The scene burned into Leon's mind, but he didn't storm inside. No, that would be too simple, too impulsive. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, his hands trembling. His heart screamed for confrontation, but his mind was already at work, spinning threads of an intricate plan. He returned home before Mira, making sure to leave no trace of his absence. When she arrived hours later, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed, Leon greeted her with the same calm he always had. "Long rehearsal?" he asked, his voice even. Mira nodded, slipping past him to avoid his gaze. "Daniel thinks we're finally ready for the showcase," she said, her words light but empty. Leon didn't press her further. He merely nodded, his expression unreadable. But as Mira disappeared into their bedroom, Leon's resolve hardened. If she wanted to play this game, he would let her. But he would control the final act. As the clock struck midnight, Leon sat down at the piano, his fingers gliding over the keys with renewed purpose. The notes came easily now, each one weaving a story of love, betrayal, and vengeance. It would be his masterpiece, and Mira would be the unwitting star. In the silence of the room, Leon allowed himself a grim smile. The overture had begun, and the stage was already being set. The days that followed were deceptively calm. Leon maintained the facade of a doting husband, playing the role of a man none the wiser to Myra's deceit. His hands moved deftly across the piano as he worked tirelessly on his composition, a piece so intricate it became an obsession. Mira, meanwhile, seemed more emboldened. She no longer hesitated when leaving for her rehearsals, and her returns grew later and later. Leon kept up appearances, always ready with a warm smile or a quiet question about her day. But his nights were spent in the shadows, collecting fragments of truth. One evening, while Mira was out, Leon made his move. She had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter, a rare slip in her careful routine. With the precision of a predator stalking prey, Leon unlocked it, navigating through her messages. The truth unraveled before him in painful clarity. Exchanges with Daniel weren't just professional. They were charged, intimate, unmistakably damning. The messages revealed more than just their affair. They discussed plans to use Myra's influence to sabotage Leon's upcoming showcase. Daniel had been leaking Leon's music to rival composers, ensuring that his work would be overshadowed before it even debuted. Leon felt the sting of betrayal, sharper and deeper than he'd imagined. It wasn't just his heart that Mira had broken. It was his trust, his career, his very identity. Still, Leon didn't allow the anger to consume him. Instead, he let it fuel his focus. He forwarded the incriminating messages to his own phone, ensuring he had every word, every detail. Then he carefully erased any sign of his tampering and returned the phone to its place. The betrayal needed to be perfect, Myra's and his own. The next morning, Leon joined Mira at the breakfast table, his demeanor as composed as ever. She sipped her coffee absent-mindedly, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing within him. "I've been working on something special," Leon said, breaking the silence. Mira looked up, her expression faintly distracted. "Another composition?" Leon nodded. "A new opera. I'm calling it The Symphony of Shadows. It's my most ambitious work yet." Her eyes flickered with faint curiosity, but there was a hesitation there, a sign she was treading carefully. "What's it about?" Leon leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "It's a story of love and betrayal, a partnership torn apart by lies and ambition. I think it'll resonate with people." Mira paused, her expression unreadable, before offering a thin smile. "I'm sure it will. You've always had a way of capturing emotion." Leon returned the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I was thinking of showcasing it during the gala in 2 months. It'll be the highlight of the evening." Mira nodded absently, as if already calculating how this might affect her and Daniel's plans. Leon's heart ached to see her so detached, so far from the woman he once adored. But his resolve remained unshaken. As Mira rose to leave for another rehearsal, Leon caught her wrist gently. "You should be part of it," he said, his tone warm and earnest. She blinked, momentarily startled. "Me? Of course. You're my muse, Mira. I can't imagine bringing this story to life without you." The words hung in the air, a delicate thread binding them together, though Leon knew it was frayed and ready to snap. Mira hesitated before nodding, her smile tight. "I'd love to." Leon watched her leave, the click of her heels echoing in the hallway. When the door closed behind her, he turned back to the piano, his fingers poised over the keys. The symphony was taking shape, each note a weapon, each movement a step closer to his revenge. And when the curtain rose, the world would know the truth. Leon's days were consumed with orchestrating his masterpiece. From dawn until dusk, he poured himself into the composition, every note imbued with the raw emotions that churned inside him. The opera wasn't merely music. It was a coded confession, a labyrinth of sound and story that mirrored the betrayal he had uncovered. Myra's role was central. Her voice, her presence, her very essence would carry the weight of the tragedy he was crafting. Yet she remained oblivious, her focus split between Daniel and the rehearsals she still pretended were innocent. At night, Leon pieced together the rest of his plan. He combed through the messages he had extracted from her phone, finding evidence of Daniel's schemes and Myra's complicity. He reached out to a trusted friend, Simon, a fellow composer who had seen his share of treachery in the cutthroat world of music. "Simon," Leon said one evening over the phone, his voice low, "I need your help. This stays between us." Simon didn't ask questions, sensing the gravity in Leon's tone. "What do you need?" "I'm working on a new opera, something big," Leon explained. "But I need someone I trust to act as my second set of eyes. Someone to help oversee the logistics, the casting, the details I can't manage alone." Simon hesitated before agreeing. "If you're asking, it must be important. You've always been one to handle everything yourself." "It is," Leon said simply. "And it has to be flawless." Myra's enthusiasm for the opera seemed to grow, though Leon suspected it wasn't for the reasons he had hoped. She discussed the role he had written for her with Daniel, whose influence was evident in her sudden bursts of unsolicited suggestions. "Maybe the soprano should have a moment of defiance in the third act," she offered one evening, her voice light. Leon smiled at her from across the piano, his fingers trailing along the keys. "Interesting idea. I'll think about it." In truth, he had already written every detail of the opera, down to the subtle undertones that hinted at her betrayal. But he let Mira believe she had a hand in its creation, her suggestions feeding her illusion of control. As the weeks passed, Mira threw herself into rehearsals with an energy Leon hadn't seen in years. She practiced tirelessly, her voice soaring through the house as she perfected her arias. Daniel was often mentioned in passing, his name a shadow that darkened every room it touched. Still, Leon played the part of the supportive husband. He listened patiently to her updates, encouraged her progress, and celebrated her successes. All the while, his plans tightened around her like a noose. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Mira leaned against him, her exhaustion evident. "This opera feels different," she murmured. "It's like it has a soul of its own." Leon's heart twisted at the words, but he kept his expression calm. "Maybe because it's the most personal piece I've ever written." Mira didn't respond, her breathing evening out as she drifted to sleep against his shoulder. Leon sat still, his gaze fixed on the flickering shadows cast by the fireplace. She would soon understand just how personal this opera was. The weeks bled into months, and the gala approached. Leon worked tirelessly, ensuring every detail of the performance was perfect. The cast was assembled, the stage designed, and the orchestra rehearsed under his meticulous direction. Myra's excitement was palpable, her anticipation almost childlike. She reveled in the attention she received during rehearsals, the admiration of her peers, and the praise from Daniel. Leon watched her with a quiet detachment, knowing the moment of reckoning was near. The opera was no longer just a performance. It was a weapon, a meticulously crafted act of vengeance. And when the curtain rose on opening night, Mira and Daniel would find themselves at the heart of a story they could no longer escape. The evening of the gala arrived with all the grandeur expected of the event. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the grand theater, and the audience, a mix of elites and critics, buzzed with anticipation. This was no ordinary performance. It was the unveiling of Leon's much-awaited new opera, The Symphony of Shadows. Backstage, the performers made their final preparations. Mira stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the intricate costume Leon had commissioned for her. She radiated confidence, her voice warm as she exchanged pleasantries with the other cast members. But behind her polished facade, Leon detected a trace of nerves, a flicker of unease she couldn't quite mask. "You look stunning," Leon said as he approached, his voice smooth and reassuring. Mira turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. "This is the biggest night of my career," she said softly, her words laced with vulnerability. Leon smiled, his gaze steady. "And you're going to shine brighter than ever." Her lips curved into a small smile, and for a fleeting moment, Leon saw the woman he had once fallen in love with. It made the betrayal sting anew, but it also steeled his resolve. As Mira moved to join the other performers, Leon turned his attention to Simon, who stood nearby, clipboard in hand. "Everything's in place?" Leon asked under his breath. Simon nodded, his expression serious. "Every detail. The orchestra is ready, the projections are cued, and the final act, well, it'll be unforgettable." Leon's chest tightened at the thought. It has to be. The performance began with a hush that fell over the audience like a velvet curtain. The overture, rich and haunting, set the tone for the story to come. Leon conducted with precision, his movements commanding yet restrained, every flick of his wrist coaxing emotion from the orchestra. On stage, Mira captivated the audience. Her voice soared, weaving the tale of a woman torn between loyalty and ambition. The story unfolded in layers, each act revealing more of the soprano's betrayal against the composer she once loved. Leon watched from the conductor's stand, his heart pounding as the parallels to their own lives played out before him. The lyrics, the staging, the subtle nuances, all designed to mirror Myra's infidelity and deceit. But the audience remained oblivious. To them, it was a masterful narrative, a tragic love story brought to life with breathtaking artistry. It was during the intermission that Myra's unease began to deepen. She approached Leon, her brow furrowed. "This opera, it's hauntingly familiar," she said, her voice low. Leon gave her a placid smile. "That's the beauty of art, isn't it? It speaks to the soul, even when we don't expect it." Mira hesitated, as though weighing her words, before nodding and retreating to the dressing room. Meanwhile, Daniel lingered at the edge of the backstage area, his demeanor smug. Leon watched him from the shadows, the sight of the man stoking the fire of his rage. Daniel had no idea what awaited him, or how thoroughly his schemes were about to unravel. As the final act approached, the tension in the theater was palpable. The story had reached its peak, the soprano's betrayal revealed to the composer in a devastating confrontation. Mira delivered her aria with unmatched emotion, her voice trembling as she sang of regret, of choices that could never be undone. Leon felt a twisted satisfaction as he conducted her performance, knowing the climax was near. The stage darkened, and a series of projected images flickered to life against the backdrop. The audience murmured in confusion, then shock, as the images shifted from abstract visuals to something unmistakably personal. Screenshots of messages, intimate photos, and damning proof of Mira and Daniel's affair. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a stunned silence. On stage, Mira froze, her voice faltering as she registered the images. Her face turned pale, her eyes darting toward the orchestra pit where Leon stood, unyielding. Daniel, seated among the audience, rose abruptly, his face a mask of fury and panic. But there was nowhere to run. The final notes of the opera rang out, somber and haunting, as the curtain fell. The room erupted into chaos. Whispers, accusations, and disbelief filling the air. And through it all, Leon stood motionless, his expression calm, as the vengeance he had orchestrated unfolded with devastating precision. As the curtain fell, Mira stumbled backstage, her breaths shallow and uneven. The projected images burned in her mind. Every message, every photo laid bare before hundreds of eyes. She found Leon waiting for her near the wings, his face a mask of calm that only deepened her panic. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice trembling. Leon tilted his head, his eyes cold. "I told our story. Did I not do it justice?" Myra's mouth opened, but no words came. The realization that she was now both a public and private pariah left her shaken. From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel pushing through the backstage crowd, his face flushed with anger. He grabbed her arm, but Leon's voice cut through the chaos. "You might want to keep your hands off her, Daniel," Leon said, his tone icy. "The audience didn't just see your affair. They saw your part in sabotaging me." Daniel froze, his grip loosening. He glanced around, realizing that everyone was watching him now, whispers spreading like wildfire. Mira stood between them, her betrayal exposed, her alliance with Daniel now a shared burden of disgrace. She opened her mouth to speak, but Leon turned and walked away, leaving her in the wreckage of her choices. The aftermath was chaos. Whispers filled the theater, swelling into murmurs of scandal that no one could ignore. Mira stood frozen, surrounded by a mix of judgmental stares and pitying glances. Daniel had already slipped out, his cowardice on full display. Leon, however, moved through the crowd with calculated grace, acknowledging compliments on his bold and daring narrative. No one dared approach the subject of the final act directly, but the knowing looks told him the message had been received. Mira finally found her voice, rushing to confront him in the lobby. "You destroyed me," she spat, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. Leon met her glare with quiet resolve. "No, Mira," he said, his voice calm. "You destroyed yourself. I simply gave the world a front row seat." Before she could respond, a reporter approached, microphone in hand, eager to dissect the scandal. Leon stepped aside, leaving Mira to face the questions alone. And in that moment, the full weight of her betrayal came crashing down. While Mira faced the judgment of the theater crowd, Daniel's escape offered no reprieve. Outside, reporters swarmed him, their questions sharp and relentless. "Did you know about the sabotage? How long has the affair been going on? Do you have a response to the evidence?" Daniel's confidence crumbled as he stammered denials, sweat beading on his brow. His polished persona, so carefully maintained, shattered in the face of undeniable proof. He pushed through the crowd, but the damage was done. By the time he reached his car, his phone was already flooded with calls. Angry messages from clients, sponsors, and even his own colleagues. The reputation he'd built was collapsing, and deep down, he knew there was no recovering from the storm Leon had unleashed. The following morning, Mira woke to silence in the home she once shared with Leon. His side of the bed was cold, his belongings noticeably absent. She reached for her phone, only to find it inundated with messages. Some were from friends offering hollow sympathy, others from people she barely knew, relishing the spectacle. But the most painful messages came from the opera community. Invitations to future showcases were rescinded, partnerships severed. She had become untouchable not because of her affair, but because of how publicly her betrayal had been exposed. She tried calling Daniel, but he didn't answer. The voicemail beep echoed in her ear, a sharp reminder that she was now truly alone. Leon spent the day in his favorite cafe, away from the chaos he had unleashed. The local papers were abuzz with headlines, "Scandal at the Opera," and "A Symphony of Deceit Unveiled." He sipped his coffee, scanning the articles with quiet satisfaction. The critics had lauded his opera as a masterpiece, a raw and fearless exploration of betrayal and revenge. Simon joined him later, setting a copy of the paper on the table. "You've created something unforgettable," he said, his tone carrying both admiration and caution. Leon nodded, his expression serene. That was the point. Now the world knows the truth. But beneath his calm exterior, a flicker of melancholy stirred. Victory, as sweet as it was, came with the ache of knowing he had loved someone who would never truly understand the depth of what they had lost. Daniel's world unraveled rapidly. His name was splashed across headlines, his involvement in the sabotage confirmed by leaked emails and messages. Ones Leon had anonymously provided to journalists. Sponsors abandoned him, casting him out of the elite circles he once dominated. Former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by association. Even his clients, who once revered him, now turned their backs in disgust. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation, Daniel issued a public statement. He blamed miscommunication and personal struggles. But the excuses only fueled the backlash. By the end of the week, Daniel's career was in ruins. His once lofty ambitions reduced to whispers of betrayal and disgrace. Unable to endure the isolation, Mira showed up at Leon's new apartment unannounced. She looked fragile, her once glamorous appearance dimmed by sleepless nights and public scorn. "Leon," she began, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk?" He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I don't think there's anything left to say, Mira." Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded. "I made mistakes, terrible ones, but I can't fix them if you won't give me a chance." Leon's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Fix them? Or undo the consequences?" She flinched, his words cutting deeper than any public humiliation. "I still love you," she whispered, desperation dripping from every syllable. He shook his head slowly. "Love isn't what you did, Mira. It's gone. Just like the trust you shattered." Before she could respond, he closed the door, leaving her alone in the hallway, drowning in the silence of her own regrets. Mira didn't leave quietly. Reeling from Leon's rejection, she made a desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruins of her life. She turned to Daniel, hoping their shared disgrace might unite them. But when she finally tracked him down, she found him packing up his studio, his face hard with bitterness. "You think I'll take you back?" Daniel sneered. "You're as much to blame as I am." Myra's breath caught. You thought wrong," he snapped, cutting her off. "I don't need dead weight dragging me further down." The finality in his words hit her harder than Leon's cold dismissal. Mira was left standing in the empty studio, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like an iron vice. She had betrayed everything she once held dear, and now there was no one left to stand by her side. Mira returned to her empty home, the silence pressing down like a physical force. She looked around at the remnants of a life she had destroyed. A framed photo of her and Leon at their first gala, dusty awards on the mantel, a piano that hadn't been touched in weeks. Despair turned to anger as she opened her laptop and scoured the news. Leon's opera was everywhere, celebrated as a groundbreaking work of genius. The same critics who once sang her praises now spoke of her betrayal with scorn. Unable to bear it, she typed a long, rambling email to Leon. She alternated between apologizing and accusing, her words desperate and erratic. When she hit send, Mira felt a fleeting sense of relief, but as the minutes stretched into hours with no reply, the truth settled in. Leon had moved on, and her words could no longer reach him. She closed the laptop, tears blurring her vision, realizing she had no one left to blame but herself. Leon received Myra's email late that night. He read it once, the words spilling with regret, anger, and desperation. He felt no anger as he finished, only a hollow kind of pity. Instead of responding, Leon returned to his piano. The keys beneath his fingers felt lighter now, unburdened by the weight of his past. He began composing, the notes flowing effortlessly. A new piece, one not tied to betrayal but to renewal. Mira, meanwhile, faced a life stripped of illusion. The world had moved on, and she was left with the shadows of her choices. Her voice, once celebrated, now fell silent in the echo of her ruin. And as Leon's symphony grew, filling the night with a quiet beauty, the story of their love and its destruction reached its final irrevocable note.